You think you know the pyramids. You've seen them 1,000 times on thumbnails, in memes, in documentaries, on tourists' t-shirts. Three triangles against a desert backdrop. They've long since turned into a kind of visual noise. Your eyes slide over them, your brain nods and says, yeah, ancient Egypt, tombs, pharaohs, moving on. And that's the main trick. The more often you see the pyramids, the less you actually think about them. They turn into a postcard, a picture without content. The real story begins at the exact moment you stop treating them like background and ask the most uncomfortable question in the world. Okay, but why was this even necessary? Because if the pyramids are just tombs, then we're looking at the strangest investment in human history. Imagine a state where everything rests on harvests, water, and ritual, where every year is a lottery. Will the river flood or not? Where famine isn't an abstraction, but a very real possibility. And in that system, someone says, let's spend 20 years building not a canal, not a dam, not a fortress. Let's build a mountain of stone. For one person. Not the most rational decision, honestly. And the most surprising part isn't even that someone suggested it. The most surprising part is that people agreed and carried it out. A pyramid is not a house for the dead. It's a statement for the living. It's a way of speaking to society without words. When you live in a mud brick hut, when your life depends on the river's flood, when you fear drought more than war, a gleaming white mountain with a golden vershina rises beside you. And you understand the message instantly, without a translator. Power here isn't just strong, it's eternal. It isn't temporary. It isn't negotiable. It stands as if the earth itself belongs to it. And in that moment, the pharaoh gains something you can't achieve with an army, taxes, or propaganda, a sense of inevitability. But then comes the dullest and most important part. Because no matter how much we talk about religion, symbolism, and the afterlife, the pyramids are, above all, logistics. And logistics is what kills any romance. Stone isn't moved by prayers. Stone is moved by hands, ropes, food, water, discipline, accounting, planning, and thousands of small decisions that cannot fail. Not for a week. Not later. Not somehow. And you stand in front of the pyramid and it slowly hits you. This wasn't built. This was organized. You have to quarry the stone. You have to transport the stone. You have to raise the stone. You have to set the stone so it sits right and doesn't slip. You have to feed people every day. You have to treat injuries. You have to repair tools. You have to manage conflicts. You have to account for time, seasons, heat, exhaustion. You need a system that works not for a day, not for a month, but for years on end, without breakdowns. And this is where the pyramids stop being a miracle and become something far more unsettling. They become proof that people knew how to manage complexity. And that's exactly why the myth that the pyramids were built by slaves sounds so appealing. It explains everything with one word: forced. So you don't have to think. You don't have to dig deeper. You don't have to admit intelligence. But the problem is, archaeology doesn't like that version. Because they find workers' settlements. They find decent diets. They find medical care. They find healed fractures. They find signs that people weren't discarded the moment they broke. That doesn't fit well with the image of an anonymous mass driven forward by the whip. And that's where a more uncomfortable version appears. Maybe the pyramids were built not because people were forced, but because the system could afford it. Because there were professionals, teams, crews, people who knew how to haul, how to lay, how to measure, how to survive under the sun. And if that's true, the pyramids stop being a story about violence. They become a story about organization, about discipline, about managing people and resources at a level that still looks impressive even today. There's another detail people often miss. When we picture pyramid builders, For some reason, we imagine people who understand nothing, half-naked poor souls just following orders. But pyramids are not built by people who understand nothing. Even if you're hauling blocks, you have to understand order, signals, rhythm, responsibility. You have to understand that if you make a mistake, that mistake travels down the chain. And at the top of that pyramid, not the stone one, but the managerial one, stand people who think not in days and months, but in years. And that's the hardest thing to admit. To admit that ancient people could be not primitive, but incredibly disciplined. Now let's go inside, because everyone's expectation is the same. You think there's treasure in there. Gold, hidden caches, a secret room, something worth all that effort. And then you walk the corridors, see granite blocks, heavy ceilings, complex engineering, and you run into emptiness. There isn't what the legend promised, and that emptiness becomes fuel for doubt. Emptiness does two things. First, it creates a question. Where's the body? Second, it creates a more toxic question. What if this isn't a tomb at all? And right on schedule, the theories walk into the room. They always enter krasiva. They always sound confident. They always give a simple answer to a complicated thing. A beacon, a power station, a star map, a message to descendants, a machine for energy, anything at all, so we don't have to admit we don't fully understand people of the past. Some people start dividing measurements. They get excited about pi. They get excited about the golden ratio. And it really does look convincing, right up until you remember one simple thing. Math works everywhere. If you really want to, you can find sacred meaning even in a saucepan lid. And the pyramids are a gigantic geometric form where the human brain overheats and starts seeing a message where there may be only shape. But there's a reason the pyramids hook modern people so hard. We're used to thinking progress is a straight line. Yesterday we had sticks. Today we have rockets. Tomorrow we'll have something else. The pyramids break that picture. They look like a leap. Like a peak, after which nothing quite like it happened for a long time. And that's unsettling. Because it suggests civilizations can reach extreme heights and then lose skills, not because they became dumber, but because their priorities changed. And here is where real science begins. Not the kind that promises a sensation, but the kind that digs literally. It looks for diaries, transport routes, settlement traces, food remains, tools, supply chains. And when you look at it all together, the picture becomes less mystical, but far more impressive. This was a national project. Massive, systemic, human. And yet, even science still has questions it honestly can't close. Because the pyramids aren't a museum exhibit with a neat label that says, case closed. They still find voids. They still argue about the purpose of shafts. New data still appears that forces people to rewrite details. And that's normal. History isn't a verdict. History is an investigation that lasts for centuries. And this is where we come to the most important idea. The pyramids are a mirror. They don't show Egypt. They show us. Our habit of thinking we're the peak of development. Our confidence that the past was humanity's childhood. Our hunger for simple answers. And our fear of admitting that people without the internet could have been brilliantly organized. The pyramids don't give you a comfortable ending. They force you to choose. Either you believe it's impossible without magic, or you accept that human discipline, systems, and collective effort can create things that look like magic. And honestly, the second option is even scarier. Because if people did this, then humanity once knew how to build eternity, not metaphorically, literally. And here it's worth pausing and admitting something plainly. The pyramids aren't just a historical object. They're a perfect magnet for myths. They attract everything from academic hypotheses to outright madness. And that's not surprising. The fewer answers you have, the more you want to believe a beautiful story. And the pyramids, unfortunately, resist any final explanation. For example, One of the most persistent myths is the idea that pyramids somehow affect the space around them, that food spoils more slowly inside, that razor blades supposedly sharpen themselves, that plants grow faster. These ideas especially flourished in the 20th century, when humanity suddenly decided that shape itself could be a source of energy. People made cardboard pyramids and put razors, clocks, food, cats, sometimes even themselves inside. The results were usually strictly personal and depended on the experimenter's imagination. But the myth remained, because it's convenient. It says the pyramid isn't just stone, it's a device, which means it's smarter than us. There are also more scientific myths that look more respectable, like the idea that the Great Pyramid perfectly encodes the size of the Earth, the planet's rotation, the distance to the Sun, basically half the universe. It usually works like this. One value is divided by another, then by a third, then multiplied by 10, because that's more convenient. And suddenly you get a number you really want to call meaningful. It looks impressive right up until you realize that with enough determination you can encode anything that way, even a bus route number. Another category of myths is the stars. Orion. Sirius. Orion's belt, a heavenly river mirrored in the Nile. It all sounds beautiful, and importantly, it's partly true. The Egyptians really did watch the sky. They did align structures. They did connect the afterlife with stars. The problem starts where careful observation turns into an absolute scheme, where every mismatch is explained by, "We just haven't understood everything yet." That's a very comfortable position. It demands no proof, only belief. Here's another interesting fact that rarely makes it into popular videos. The pyramids weren't built suddenly. They didn't appear out of nowhere. Before them came mastabas, simpler, lower tombs. Then came step pyramids, then experimental ones, bent ones, uneven ones, ones that look like they were built by people who made mistakes, rebuilt sections, and changed the angle mid-construction. And that, arguably, is one of the strongest arguments against the higher technology idea. Because higher technology doesn't make mistakes in such a human way. There's a pyramid where the slope resca changes halfway up, as if at some point the architect realized that if they kept going, the whole thing would collapse. That doesn't look like a divine plan. That looks like something very earthly. Guys, we miscalculated, save the project. And they did. The pyramid still stands. Crooked, but standing. Another detail that often gets dropped: the pyramids weren't built in a void. Around them were towns, settlements, storehouses, breweries. Yes, breweries. Because workers had to be paid, and part of that payment was beer and bread, in enormous quantities. This was an economy real, organized, with supply, distribution, and accounting. And that clashes badly with the image of a chaotic crowd just dragging stones at a tyrant's command. Sometimes people say, fine, maybe they could build it, but why so complicated? And here we return to the most uncomfortable thought. Maybe complexity was the point. Maybe the pyramid wasn't meant to be rational. It was meant to be excessive, overbuilt, disproportionate, because that's the language of power. It doesn't explain, it demonstrates. There's also a very modern myth that the pyramids can't be replicated today, that modern engineers couldn't do it. That isn't quite true. They could. The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is why. Because today, nobody will spend 20 years building an object with no practical function just to sit there and press down on the human mind. The modern world doesn't think that way. We want returns. We want efficiency. We want ROI. And the pyramids are a project with no payback except one: symbolic. And that's where the pyramids become uncomfortable again. Because they remind us that civilizations can live not only by the logic of utility, they can live by the logic of meaning. Even if that meaning feels strange, excessive, or frightening to us today. And maybe that's exactly why the pyramids still affect people. Not because they hide a secret, but because they hide a question. A question about what a society is capable of if it believes in an idea long enough. A question about what we ourselves consider worthy of decades of thousands of lives. And a question about what kinds of traces we think matter. Because the pyramids aren't about Egypt. They're about choice, priorities, scale. About how sometimes humanity builds not for itself, and not even for descendants, but for the idea of eternity itself. And maybe that's what scares us most of all.